The year is 1470. High on the limestone cliffs above the Aegean, the air smells of sulfur and burning vellum. Inside the convent of St. Anna, Sister Ilara stands before a roaring hearth. She holds the golden prayer book, a masterpiece of faith that has survived 3 centuries. But she doesn't hide it. With trembling hands, she tears out the pages and feeds them to the fire. Outside, the horizon is dark with the banners of the Ottoman Empire. They are not coming to kill these women. They are coming to inventory them, to turn them into numbers in a ledger, to erase their names and their God. Ilara knows that once the soldiers enter, the only safe place for the truth is inside her own mind. She burns the book to save it, forcing her eyes to memorize the ink before it turns to ash. What happened next is a story of survival that defies belief. It is not about a battle of swords, but a battle of memory. A battle fought by women who refused to become ghosts. Here on Crimson Historians, we dig into the archives the world forgot. We find the stories written in invisible ink and the prayers carved in dark caves. Every view helps us pull one more voice out of the silence. Now let's go back to that fire, because the heavy oak doors are splintering, and the scribes are waiting with their pens. The morning did not break with the sun. It broke with the sky bleeding into the sea. A thick, suffocating gray fog rolled off the Aegean, clinging to the limestone cliffs where the convent of St. Anna had stood for 3 centuries. But today, the salt in the air was choked by the acrid stench of sulfur and burning timber. The city below the cliffs, once a vibrant tapestry of red-tiled roofs and fishing boats, was gone. In its place lay a smoldering ruin, swallowed by the relentless advance of an empire that flowed like a river of steel. Inside the convent's main hall, the stone floor trembled rhythmically. It was not an earthquake. It was the synchronized march of thousands of boots slamming against the earth. Mother Superior Sophia, a woman whose face usually held the stern, unyielding composure of the cliffs themselves, now looked fragile. Her hands, veined and trembling, clutched a heavy object wrapped in velvet. She was the anchor of this holy house, but the storm outside had finally broken her. "Ilara!" she gasped, thrusting the bundle into the younger woman's arms. "Take it! The crypts, the loose stone behind the icon of St. Peter. Go!" Sister Ilara stared at the heavy bundle. She was 20 years old, with eyes that were too sharp, too observant for a life of silent contemplation. Her hands were not smooth like a lady's, but calloused and strong from years of working the loom. She was the convent's finest weaver, possessing a mind that could recall the intricate pattern of 1,000 threads without a single error. "Mother," Ilara said, her voice tight, "the crypts are the first place they will look. They are not looters. They are conquerors." "Do as I say," Sophia cried out, a tear finally escaping down her withered cheek. "It is the golden prayer book. It contains the illuminations of our founders. It is the proof of our history. It cannot be touched by their hands." Ilara took the book. The velvet slipped, revealing the cover, beaten gold, encrusted with rubies that looked like drops of fresh blood in the dim light. It was heavy with centuries of devotion. A thunderous crash echoed from the courtyard. The great oak doors had splintered. They were here. Ilara looked around the room. The stone walls offered no sanctuary. The loose floorboards were too obvious. The altar was too exposed. Panic threatened to seize her throat, but her mind, that cold, analytical machine that made her a master weaver, took over. They would strip this place. They would tap every wall, overturn every stone. They would find the gold. They would melt it down, and they would burn the parchment as kindling for their victory fires. There was no place to hide the object, so she had to save the essence. Ilara turned not to the door, but to the great hearth that dominated the eastern wall. A fire was already dying there, reduced to glowing orange embers. "Ilara, no!" Mother Sophia screamed, lunging forward, but her old legs were too slow. Ilara fell to her knees before the heat. With shaking hands, she ripped the golden cover off the spine, tossing the precious metal aside as if it were trash. She held the thick stack of vellum pages. The ink was vibrant, azure, crimson, and gold leaf script that danced in the firelight. She threw the pages onto the embers. The dry parchment curled instantly. The edges blackened. Ilara did not look away. She widened her eyes until they burned from the heat and smoke. She focused with a terrifying intensity on the pages as they began to writhe in the flames. Page 1, the Alpha, the genealogy. Page 2, the Psalm of Lament. Page 10, the Hymn of the Sea. Her mind raced, snapping mental images of the text faster than the fire could consume them. She forced the shape of the letters into her memory, weaving them into the neural tapestry of her mind, just as she wove thread into cloth. She felt the physical pain of the fire on her face, but she transmuted it into a lock, sealing the words behind a wall of trauma and focus. Burn, she thought violently. Burn so they cannot touch you. Come into me. The heavy wooden doors of the hall burst open. They did not run in screaming like barbarians. They flowed in with terrifying discipline. The janissaries, men of war dressed in uniforms that were clean, sharp, and terrifyingly uniform. They formed a perimeter in seconds, their scimitars sheathed, their muskets held at the ready. Behind them walked men who carried no weapons. They wore long robes stained with ink and carried thick, leather-bound ledgers. These were the scribes. They looked at the terrified nuns huddled in the corner not with lust or hatred, but with the cold, dead eyes of accountants counting sheep. One scribe dipped a quill into a travel ink pot tied to his waist. He pointed at a sobbing novice. Female, approximate age 15, unskilled, domestic grouping. He wrote it down. He pointed at another. Female, age 40, frail. Disposal recommended. He wrote it down. They were not people. They were assets. They were numbers in a ledger that would be filed in a capital city hundreds of miles away. Ilara remained on her knees before the fire, her back to them. The last page of the golden prayer book was curling into a black, flaky crisp. The words were gone from the world. "Stand up," a voice boomed. It was deep, resonant, and spoke their language with a perfect, mocking accent. Ilara stood and turned. Standing in the center of the hall was the commander. He was a towering figure, his armor polished to a mirror sheen beneath a cloak of crimson silk. His beard was trimmed with geometric precision. He did not look like a monster. He looked like a king. His eyes scanned the room, ignoring the weeping Mother Sophia, and landed on the gold cover lying discarded on the floor. Then his gaze shifted to the fireplace, to the pile of fresh black ash that still retained the ghostly rectangular shape of a book. The commander walked forward, the sound of his boots echoing in the silence. He stopped beside Ilara. He smelled of rose water and iron. He crouched down and picked up a poker. He stirred the ashes. A single fragment of unburnt vellum floated up, gray and brittle, before disintegrating into dust. He stood up, towering over Ilara. A small, amused smile played on his lips. It was the smile of a man who had seen everything and valued nothing. He kicked the golden cover with the toe of his boot. "You stripped the gold," he said softly. "Smart. You thought we came only for the metal?" He looked at the ashes again. A waste. That was the Codex of St. Anna, was it not? 1,000 years of history. Ilara stared at his chest, refusing to meet his eyes, her breathing shallow. Her heart was hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. The commander leaned in close. "You think you have denied me a trophy," he whispered, "but you have only denied yourself your history. Look at it." He gestured to the pile of soot. "Your god is burnt. He is ash and dust, just like your city." He turned his back on her, dismissing her as easily as one dismisses a stray dog. "Scribe," he called out. "This one has spirit. Marker for the imperial looms. Grade A asset." Ilara stood frozen. The heat of the fire was still on her face. The commander thought he had won. He thought he had erased them. But inside the dark, quiet cathedral of her mind, the pages were turning. The gold leaf was shining in a mental sun that never set. The ink was wet and fresh. "Kyrie Ellison," she recited silently, the words screaming in her head. "Lord have mercy." She looked at the back of the commander's head. "You have the ash," she thought. "I have the fire." The road to the coast was not a road. It was a wound cut into the limestone, jagged and unforgiving under the white glare of the noon sun. For 3 days the column of prisoners had moved like a disjointed snake, the rattle of chains and the scuff of bare feet providing a grim rhythm to their march. The air was thick with dust, coating the women's habits until they looked like statues carved from the gray earth itself. Sister Ilara walked near the back. The rope binding her wrists chafed against the skin, wet with sweat and grit. Her throat was a parched canyon, but her mind remained dangerously active. She was reciting the book of Genesis silently, the words she had memorized from the flames keeping her upright. Beside her walked Sister Martha. Martha was the oldest of them, a woman of 70 winters whose spine was permanently curved from decades of tending the convent's herb gardens. She had been the one who brewed teas for fevers and salves for burns. Now, she was a liability. Her breath came in ragged, wet gasps that rattled in her narrow chest. The procession halted abruptly. A wheel on one of the supply wagons had struck a rut. Taking advantage of the pause, a scribe named Ibrahim dismounted from his mule. He was a small, fastidious man with ink-stained fingers and a face that seemed perpetually pinched in calculation. He walked down the line of women, checking his ledger. He did not look at their faces, he looked at their feet and their breathing. "Efficiency is dropping," Ibrahim muttered to a nearby guard, tapping his quill against the parchment. "Asset degradation is accelerating. The standard allowance for transport wastage is 20%. We are currently at 0. We have room to trim." It was a cold, bureaucratic truth. In the logistics of empire, human cargo had a depreciation rate. If the weak slowed the column, they cost more in food and time than their labor would ever repay. As the wagon wheel was freed and the shout to march rang out, the reality of Ibrahim's calculation struck. Sister Martha took one step, then another. Then, her knees simply vanished. There was no cry, only the soft thud of a body hitting the hard-packed dirt. She did not move to break her fall. She lay crumpled like a discarded sack of grain, her cheek pressed into the dust. A Janissary guard, a brute of a man with arms the size of tree trunks, strode over. He nudged Martha with his boot. She groaned weakly, a sound barely audible over the wind. "Dead weight," the guard grunted. He looked at the cliff edge, only a few yards away, where the road dropped sharply into a ravine filled with scrub and buzzards. He bent down, grabbing the rope connecting Martha to the others, intending to cut her loose and heave her over the side. It was not cruelty in his eyes. It was waste management. "No!" The scream tore from Ilara's throat before she could stop it. She threw herself to the ground, not to beg, but to block. She landed on her knees between the guard and Martha's prone body. "Get up!" the guard snarled, reaching for the whip coiled at his belt. Ilara did not move. "She is not refuse. She is a sister." The guard raised the whip. But before the lash could fall, another shadow fell over Ilara. Then another. Sister Magdalena, the youngest, dropped to her knees beside Ilara. Then Mother Sophia, moving with painful slowness. Then the others. Within seconds, 22 women were on their knees, forming a tight, impenetrable circle around Sister Martha. They bowed their heads, exposing their necks and backs. They were bound, they were unarmed, and they were exhausted. But they had built a fortress of flesh and bone. The guard hesitated. He had expected screaming, running, or begging. He had not expected geometry. They had locked themselves together, shoulder to shoulder, a silent wall that said, "To take her, you must go through all of us." "Whip them!" Ibrahim the scribe shouted from his mule, annoyed by the delay. "Break them up!" The lash came down. It struck Ilara across the shoulders, the leather biting through her rough tunic. She gasped, her body jerking, but she did not break the line. Another strike. This time, on Magdalena, who whimpered but leaned closer into the circle. The sound of the whip cracking against fabric and flesh echoed off the canyon walls. 1 strike. 2. 5. They did not move. They absorbed the violence as the earth absorbs rain. Enough. The command was spoken quietly, but it cut through the noise of the whip instantly. The commander rode forward on his black stallion. He looked down at the scene, the bleeding women, the frustrated guard, and the motionless body of the old nun in the center. He looked at Ilara. Her eyes were squeezed shut, sweat and tears streaking the dust on her face, but her posture was defiant. He remembered the fire. He remembered the ash. "She is dead," the commander said, his voice devoid of emotion. He could see Martha's chest had stopped moving. Ilara opened her eyes. She looked up at the man on the horse. "Then she belongs to the earth, not the vultures." The commander looked at the sun. He looked at the scribe, who was pointing frantically at his ledger and the declining sun. Then he looked back at the women. He saw their hands, hands that were legendary for weaving tapestries so fine they looked like paintings. "You wish to bury her?" the commander asked. "Very well." He signaled the guard to sheath his whip. "But we have no spades for you. We have no time for rituals. You have until the shadow of that rock touches the road." He pointed to a boulder casting a long shadow. "And you will use what you have?" He meant their hands. The circle broke. Ilara scrambled to Martha's side. She touched the old woman's forehead, whispering a final prayer, then turned to the rocky ground by the roadside. She dug. The ground was hard, baked solid by centuries of heat. Ilara drove her fingers into the grit, clawing at stones. Her fingernails, kept short and smooth for weaving silk, tore immediately. The skin on her fingertips shredded. Beside her, the other sisters dug too. There was no sound but the frantic scraping of 22 pairs of hands tearing at the earth. It was a brutal, bloody work. They were destroying the very tools of their trade, their sensitive, skilled fingers, to create a resting place for their friend. Blood mixed with the gray dirt. Ilara felt a jagged stone slice her thumb, but she didn't stop. She imagined she was weaving a pattern in reverse, unmaking the earth to create a pocket of peace. By the time the shadow touched the road, a shallow grave had been gouged out of the landscape. It was not deep, but it was enough. They lowered Sister Martha into the hole. There was no shroud, only the dust. They covered her quickly, patting the earth down with their ruined, bleeding hands. "March!" the guard barked. Ilara stood up. Her hands were throbbing, dripping blood onto the white dust of the road. She looked at them, these hands that would be forced to weave for the Sultan. They were damaged now. But as she looked at the mound of fresh earth, she felt a strange, cold victory. Ibrahim the scribe marked a line through a number in his book. "Asset liquidated," he muttered, closing the ledger. But as Ilara began to walk, leaving the grave behind, she knew he was wrong. They hadn't liquidated an asset. They had consecrated a martyr. And in doing so, They had proven that the wall they built could bleed, but it would not crumble. The holding camp at Volos was a purgatory of dust and noise. It was here that the empire sorted its spoils before shipping them across the Aegean. Men were separated from women, the strong from the weak, the skilled from the laborers. It was a chaotic marketplace of human flesh, smelling of fear and roasting meat. For the first night, the 22 sisters were huddled together in a pen made of rough-hewn timber, exposed to the elements. But on the second morning, the dynamic changed. A man arrived at the pen. He was not a soldier, nor a scribe like the pinched-faced Ibrahim. He was older, rounder, dressed in a kaftan of deep blue velvet. This was Selim Bey, the administrator of the Imperial Manifest. He moved with the casual grace of a man who owned everything he looked at. He pointed a ringed finger at Mother Superior Sophia. "That one," Selim Bey said, his voice dripping with false courtesy. "She is of noble bearing. The dirt does not suit her." 2 guards stepped forward. They did not drag Sophia, they escorted her. "Mother!" Sister Magdalena cried out, lunging forward, but Ilara held her back. Sophia did not look back. She straightened her spine, smoothing her dirty habit with a dignity that seemed out of place in the filth of the camp, and walked away with the administrator. The sun set, and she did not return. Whispers began to snake through the pen like poisonous adders. Had she been killed? Had she been sold separately? Or worse? The answer came at dawn. The gates of the administrative quarters opened. Selim Bey emerged, laughing at something being said by the person beside him. It was Mother Sophia, but the woman who walked into the sunlight was a stranger. Gone was the torn, blood-stained habit. Gone was the wooden crucifix. She was draped in layers of heavy Ottoman silk, dyed the color of emeralds and wine. Her hair, usually hidden beneath a veil, was covered by a fine headdress of embroidered linen. She looked not like a prisoner, but like a courtier. She walked without chains. She held a cup of steaming liquid, coffee, a luxury none of the sisters had ever smelled, in her manicured hands. A collective gasp sucked the air out of the pen. She has turned," Magdalena whispered, her voice breaking. "She has taken the turban. She has sold us." Ilara felt a cold stone settle in her stomach. The visual was devastating. In a world of gray dust and brown rags, Sophia shone like a jewel. It was the oldest trick of empire: divide and conquer. You do not need to beat a dog if you can turn the pack against its alpha. If the holiest among them could be bought with a warm bath and a bolt of silk, what hope did the rest of them have? Selim Bey guided Sophia toward the pen. He was parading her. He wanted them to see. "Look at them, Sophia," Selim said loudly, gesturing to the starving nuns with a pitying smile. "See what stubbornness buys? A patch of dirt. But you are reasonable. You understand that faith is fluid, yes?" Sophia took a sip from her cup. Her face was a mask of porcelain calm. She looked at Ilara. She looked at Magdalena. Her eyes were empty, devoid of recognition. "They are thin," Sophia said. Her voice was flat, stripped of the warmth that used to comfort the sick. "But their hands are capable. Do not separate them, Selim. A loom requires many threads. Break the set, and you ruin the tapestry." "Perhaps," Selim mused, stroking his beard. "Or perhaps I sell the young ones to the harems in Cairo. They fetch a better price than weavers." "Then you are a fool," Sophia replied sharply. It was the tone of an aristocrat speaking to a servant. "These women weave for God. If you want them to weave for a sultan, you keep them together. Or you get nothing but clumsy fingers and tears." Selim laughed, delighted by her arrogance. "Very well, my dear convert. We shall see." They turned and walked away. As they passed, Magdalena spat through the wooden slats. The spittle landed on the hem of Sophia's emerald silk. Sophia did not flinch. She did not look down. She simply kept walking, disappearing back into the comfort of the administrator's tent. The camp fell into a heavy, suffocating silence. The betrayal was absolute. The younger sisters wept openly, not from fear of death, but from the death of their idol. Ilara sat in the corner, her mind reeling. She replayed the scene, the coldness, the arrogance. It was a perfect performance, too perfect. Night fell, bringing a biting coastal wind. The guards tossed hardtack biscuits into the pen, rations for animals. Ilara lay awake, her head resting on a rock she used as a pillow. Her heart was warring with her brain. She knew Sophia. She knew the woman who had washed the feet of lepers. Could silk truly erase a soul so quickly? She shifted, trying to find comfort on the hard ground. Her hand brushed against something beneath the rock. It felt different from the dirt. Soft. Ilara froze. Slowly, careful not to wake the guards, she pulled the object out. It was a piece of bread. Not the hardtack thrown by the guards, but a chunk of soft leavened bread from the administrator's table. And wrapped tightly around it was a scrap of fabric. Ilara sat up, shielding the object with her body. She unraveled the fabric. It was a strip of emerald silk, torn violently from a hem. She squinted in the moonlight. There was a stain on the silk. Not dirt. It was dark, rusty red. Blood. Sophia had pricked her own finger. Ilara traced the bloody markings. It was crude, drawn in haste and pain. Two curved lines intersecting. A fish. Ichthys. The ancient, secret symbol of the early Christians when they hid in the catacombs of Rome. Ilara's breath caught in her throat. She looked at the bread, then at the silk. The conversation earlier. Sophia hadn't been bargaining for her own comfort. She had been bargaining for them. Do not separate them. She was using her supposed conversion, her reasonableness, to convince Selim Bey that the nuns were a single, high-value economic unit. She was playing the role of the collaborator to ensure they weren't scattered to the slave markets of Cairo, where they would disappear forever. She was wearing the silk of Judas to do the work of a saint. Ilara looked across the sleeping forms of her sisters. Magdalena was twitching in a nightmare, tears still drying on her cheeks. They hated Sophia now, and Sophia was letting them hate her. She was absorbing their scorn to protect their lives. Ilara brought the scrap of silk to her lips. It smelled of expensive perfume and metallic blood. She tore the bread into 22 tiny pieces. She crawled to Magdalena and shook her gently. "Eat," Ilara whispered, placing a crumb on the girl's tongue. I'm not hungry," Magdalena murmured. "Eat," Ilara insisted, her voice fierce. "It is from Mother. She has not left us. She is the shield." Ilara looked toward the administrator's tent, glowing with lamplight in the distance. Somewhere inside, surrounded by luxury and enemies, an old woman was sitting alone, acting a part that would damn her name in history, just to buy them one more day together. Ilara swallowed her piece of bread. It tasted of salt. The Aegean Sea was not a body of water. It was a beast that wanted to swallow the world. For 3 days, the great Ottoman war galley had pitched and rolled through a churning gray-violet storm. Down in the bowels of the ship, on the lowest deck, the concept of day and night had ceased to exist. There was only the darkness, the smell of unwashed bodies, bile, and the terrifying rhythmic creak of timber that sounded like the ship's ribs were snapping one by one. Sister Ilara was burning. Her body, weakened by the march and the digging of Martha's grave, had succumbed to a fever that raged hotter than the fire she had stared into at the convent. She lay curled on the damp floorboards of the cargo hold, her head resting on Sister Magdalena's lap. "Water," Ilara rasped, her lips cracked and bleeding. The ink is dry." Magdalena dabbed a wet rag against Ilara's forehead, weeping silently. Hush, Ilara. Save your strength. We are almost there. But Ilara wasn't there. She was back in the great hall of St. Anna. She was watching the pages curl. She was watching the words detach themselves from the parchment and float into the air like sparks. They were burning her throat. They demanded to be let out. De profundis clamavi ad te, Domine. The whisper started low, a rasping sound that barely rose above the crashing of the waves against the hull. Domine exaudi vocem meam. Ilara sat up. Her eyes were wide, glassy, and seeing nothing of the dark hold. She saw only the text. The Latin verses she had swallowed were now clawing their way back up. Ilara, please, another sister hissed, terrified. The guards will hear. But Ilara could not stop. The fever had broken the dam. Her voice rose, gaining a strange, hollow resonance that cut through the humidity of the hold. Fiant aures tuae intendentes, in vocem deprecationis meae. The sound drifted away from the women's huddled circle. It floated past the wooden partitions and into the vast open cavern of the rowing deck. Here, 200 men sat chained to benches. They were the engine of the empire. Greeks, Serbs, Italians, Venetians, criminals, and prisoners of war. They were naked from the waist up, their bodies maps of scars and lash marks. For days, they had rowed to the beat of a drum, their only language the grunt of exertion and the scream of the boatswain. But now, the drum had stopped because of the storm. The oars were drawn in. The men sat in the dark, waiting to drown. Then, the voice reached them. It was a woman's voice, high and clear, speaking the language of the old rituals, Latin. To the Greek sailors, it was the language of the rival church. To the Turks, it was the language of the infidel. But in the dark, with death hammering against the wood, it was not theology. It was a lifeline. Luka, a massive Serbian soldier chained to the starboard bench, lifted his head. He had lost an eye in the siege of Corinth and had not spoken a word since his capture. He tilted his scarred face toward the sound. Si iniquitates observavaris, Domine. Domine, quis sustinabit? If you, O Lord, should mark iniquities, Lord, who could stand? The words washed over Luka. He didn't understand every syllable, but he understood the rhythm. It was the rhythm of a mother rocking a child. It was the rhythm of a plea to something greater than the storm. Ilara's voice grew louder. She was screaming the Psalms now, projecting them with a desperate, feverish energy. She was reciting the funeral rites, the prayers for the sick, the songs of deliverance, quia apud propitiatio est. But with you, there is forgiveness. The rowing deck fell silent. The moans of the seasick stopped. Even the rats seemed to pause in the bilges. 200 men held their breath, listening to the girl who was singing to God while the ship tried to kill them. But the silence was broken by the heavy thud of boots on the ladder. The overseer, a man named Kasim who carried a whip made of hippopotamus hide, descended into the hold. He was soaked from the rain on the deck above, and his mood was foul. The singing was a violation of order. Noise meant rebellion. He marched toward the women's corner, his face twisted in a snarl. "Silence, witch!" Kasim roared, raising the whip. "Shut your mouth or I will cut out your tongue." The sisters shrieked and huddled over Ilara, trying to shield her. But Ilara didn't even see him. She was looking at the ceiling, reciting the Gloria Patri. Kasim stepped forward, the heavy leather lash coiled to strike. "Don't touch her!" The voice was like grinding stones. It did not come from the women. Kasim froze. He turned slowly. Luka, the Serbian giant, had stood up as far as his chains would allow. The iron manacles bit into his wrists. But he didn't care. He was staring at Kasim with his one good eye, and in that eye was a promise of violence that no whip could tame. Kasim sneered. "Sit down, dog." Luka did not sit. And then, The man next to him stood up. A Venetian thief with a missing ear. Then the Greeks on the port side. Then the Italians. One by one, the oarsmen rose. The sound of 200 chains rattling at once was louder than the thunder outside. They were gaunt, starved, and weaponless, but they were staring at Qasim with a collective, terrifying unity. They were enemies of each other on land. But in this ship, under the spell of the fever voice, they were a congregation, and Ilara was their priestess. Qasim gripped his whip, his knuckles turning white. He looked at the wall of men. He looked at the fragility of his own skull compared to the iron chains they wore. If he struck the girl, the ship would not need the storm to destroy it. They would tear him apart with their teeth. The overseer lowered his arm. He spat on the floor, a gesture of impotent rage. "Keep her quiet," Qasim hissed at Magdalena, his voice trembling slightly. "Or I feed you all to the fish." He turned and climbed back up the ladder, retreating into the storm above. Down below, Ilara's voice finally faltered. She collapsed back into Magdalena's lap, the energy spent. "Amen," she whispered, and fell into a deep, comatose sleep. In the darkness of the rowing deck, Luca sat back down on his bench. The other men followed. The chains settled. The ship groaned as a massive wave hit the side, but the panic was gone. In the silence that followed, a Greek voice from the back whispered, "Amen." Then a Venetian voice, "Amen." Then a Turk, softly, in the dark, "Amin." Ilara slept, unaware that in her delirium, she had woven the first thread of a tapestry that not even the Sultan could unravel. Constantinople was a city of gold, domes, and light. To the travelers entering the Golden Horn, it appeared as a vision of paradise floating upon the water. But for the 18 surviving sisters of Saint Anna, the city was not a destination. It was a ceiling. They were unloaded from the galley at night, moving like shadows through the side streets of the Galata district. There were no crowds to gawk at them, no public shaming. They were past the point of being spectacles. They were now purely property. They were led to the massive, imposing gates of the Topkapi Palace. But they did not enter through the imperial gate where ambassadors rode on white horses. They were marched to a small, iron-reinforced door at the base of the outer wall, half hidden by overgrown ivy. As they stepped across the threshold, the air changed. The salty breeze of the Bosphorus vanished, replaced by the stagnant, heavy scent of mildew, dye, and whetstone. They descended. Down spiral staircases cut from the living bedrock. Down past the cellars where wine was stored for the janissaries. Down past the kitchens where furnaces roared like dragons. They went deeper, into the veins of the empire, until they reached the substructure. This was the world of the silent servants. The workshop was a cavernous, low-ceilinged hall that stretched into darkness. The walls wept moisture. The floor was slick with condensation. But the space was filled with the most exquisite things the human eye could behold. Looms, dozens of them, stood like wooden skeletons in the gloom. On them hung tapestries of blinding color, crimson silks, threads of spun silver, and velvets as blue as the deep ocean. "Here," a voice whispered. It was soft, high-pitched, and terrifying. A figure emerged from the shadows. He was a mountain of a man, yet his skin was as smooth as a baby's, and his face was devoid of hair. He wore the white turban of the palace eunuchs, but his robes were gray, the color of the stone walls. This was Bashir, the keeper of the loom. He glided rather than walked, his movements soundless. He stopped in front of Ilara. He did not look at her eyes. He looked at her hands. He took her wrist, lifting it to the light of a flickering tallow candle. He inspected the calluses, the scars from the grave digging, the long tapered fingers. "You exist to weave," Bashir said. His voice was a gentle coo, which made his words infinitely more sinister. Up there, he pointed a doughy finger toward the stone ceiling, is the Sultan's shadow of God on earth. He walks on beauty. You create the beauty. He dropped her hand. But you must never be heard. A weaver who speaks is a weaver who makes mistakes. If you speak, I will cut the noise from your throat. He tapped a small, sharp knife hanging at his belt. The life of the ant began. Days and nights dissolved into a singular gray timeline. There were no windows to mark the sun. Time was measured only by the length of the candle and the length of the thread. Ilara sat at a loom in the far corner next to Sister Magdalena. Their task was to weave a runner for the Hall of Ambassadors. It was to be a garden of tulips and carnations, symbols of power and perfection. The work was brutal. The silk threads were so fine they sliced into the skin like paper. The gold wire had to be hammered into the weft, requiring precision that made their eyes water and their muscles spasm. Ilara's fingers, once healed from the digging, cracked open again. Blood would bead on her fingertips. She had to learn to stop, wrap her fingers in rags and wait, for a single drop of blood on the Sultan's silk meant death. Above them, they could hear the muffled thuds of the world of light, the rhythmic marching of guards, the faint, ghostly sound of music from a feast. Sometimes the laughter of women from the harem, a sound that drifted down through the ventilation shafts like a cruel joke. Heaven is a floor above us, Ilara thought, driving the shuttle through the warp threads. And we are the fuel burning in the basement to keep it warm. The silence was the heaviest burden. They worked shoulder to shoulder but could not speak. They communicated in glances, in the way they passed the scissors, in the rhythm of their breathing. They were becoming the ghosts the Empire wanted them to be. Weeks turned into months. The dampness of the tunnel settled into their bones. A cough began to spread among them. One afternoon, or perhaps it was night, Ilara was sent to the storage alcove at the back of the workshop to fetch more skeins of crimson wool. The storage area was a chaotic pile of rotting lumber and discarded loom frames. It smelled of decay. As Ilara reached for a bundle of wool, a draft hit her face. It was cool, fresh. She paused. The air in the workshop was stagnant. Where was the wind coming from? She followed the current. It led her to the back wall, behind a massive rotting tapestry that had been thrown over a pile of debris. The tapestry was ancient, mold-eaten, depicting a forgotten battle. Ilara looked over her shoulder. Bashir was at the far end of the hall, scolding a young girl. She pulled the rotting tapestry aside. Behind it, the stone wall had collapsed slightly, revealing a jagged fissure. It wasn't a man-made door. It was a natural fault line in the bedrock, perhaps an old cistern entrance that had been sealed and forgotten centuries ago. Ilara squeezed through the crack. Inside, it was pitch black, but the air was clean. She fumbled with the flint and striker she kept in her pocket, a stolen tool for cutting thread. She lit a small scrap of wool. The sudden flare of light revealed a small, circular chamber, no wider than a carriage. It was empty, save for rubble and dust. The walls were rough-hewn stone. But to Ilara, it was not a hole. It was a cathedral. The noise of the workshop, the clacking looms, the heavy breathing of the eunuch was muffled here. The thick stone absorbed the world. It was invisible. It was silent. It was theirs. Ilara extinguished the flame and squeezed back out. Her heart was hammering against her ribs faster than it had in months. She grabbed the crimson wool and walked back to the looms. She sat down next to Magdalena. She did not speak. She could not. But she reached under the loom and gripped Magdalena's ankle. She squeezed 3 times. Father, Son, Holy Spirit. Magdalena looked at her, eyes wide with questions. Ilara tilted her head ever so slightly toward the back of the room, toward the rotting tapestry. Then she picked up her shuttle and passed it through the silk. Her eyes were no longer dull. They were sharp again. They had been buried in hell to serve the heavens. But the empire had made a mistake. They had given the ants a crack in the foundation. And Ilara knew, as she wove the Sultan's tulips, that even the smallest crack could bring down the strongest wall. 3 years is a lifetime when you live in the grave. In the subterranean world of the Topkapi, seasons did not exist. There was only the damp cold that made joints ache, and the slightly less damp cold that signaled summer above ground. The 18 sisters of St. Anna had changed. Their skin was the color of parchment, translucent and veined with blue. Their eyes, constantly straining in the dim tallow light, had grown large and sensitive, like those of deep-sea fish. But they were alive, and they had a secret. It was midnight. The heavy, rhythmic breathing of Bashir. The eunuch echoed from his sleeping quarters at the far end of the hall. Sister Magdalena moved silently through the shadows. She was thinner now, her cheekbones sharp enough to cut, but her hands had become swift and steady. She pulled a small, greasy bundle from beneath her tunic. It was a lump of congealed gray fat. For months, the sisters who were assigned to scrub the floors near the palace kitchens had been scraping the grease traps, the foul, discarded sweet from the Sultan's feasts that clogged the drains. They hid it in their sleeves, braving the risk of a beating for theft. Magdalena knelt in the corner, behind the rotting tapestry that hid their sanctuary. She mixed the rancid fat with dried rosemary stolen from the trash heaps and a few threads of waste cotton. With nimble fingers, she molded it. A candle. Ugly, smelling of roasted meat and decay, but a candle nonetheless. She slipped through the fissure in the rock. Ilara followed. Inside the hidden cave, the air was still. Magdalena struck a spark. The fat candle sputtered, then caught. A small, smoky yellow flame licked the darkness. Lux in tenebris lucet, Ilara whispered, touching the rough stone wall. The light shines in the darkness. The wall was no longer bare. Over 3 years it had become their Bible. Lacking paper or ink, they had used sharp shards of broken pottery found in the rubble to carve their prayers into the limestone. Psalm 23 was etched near the floor. The Beatitudes spiraled up the ceiling. It was a chaotic, desperate mosaic of faith, scratched by bleeding fingers in the dark. "Bring her," Ilara said softly. 2 sisters helped a figure limp into the small circle of light. It was Mother Superior Sophia. She was no longer the woman in emerald silk who had sipped coffee with the administrator. 6 months ago, the empire had decided she was no longer useful. Her hands had developed a tremor, making her useless for fine needlework. Her diplomatic value as a convert had expired with the change of a political season. So, they had thrown her back down the chute, not to the pen, but to the loom floor, to sweep the dust until she died. She was dressed in rags worse than theirs. Her hair was white and thin, her body a skeleton draped in gray wool. She collapsed against the wall, her breath rattling in her chest like dry leaves. "My daughters," Sophia rasped. Her voice was a ruin. Ilara knelt beside her, placing a hand on Sophia's cold forehead. "We are here, Mother." Magdalena brought out the sacrament. It was not a wafer. It was a crust of bread, green with mold, salvaged from the floor. The wine was a cup of water that tasted of iron. "The body of Christ," Ilara whispered, breaking a crumb and placing it on Sophia's tongue. Sophia closed her eyes. Tears leaked from the corners, tracking through the grime on her face. She chewed slowly, savoring the moldy bread as if it were manna. "I am sorry," Sophia whispered, gripping Ilara's hand with surprising strength. "I wore the silk, so you could wear the wool. I wanted to buy you time." "You bought us life," Ilara replied, her voice fierce. You are the shield, Mother. We never forgot. Sophia smiled, a ghostly expression that illuminated her face more than the fat candle ever could. Do not just survive, Elara. She coughed, a wet, terrible sound that splattered blood onto her tunic. The ledger, Sophia gasped, her eyes finding Elara's. They see us as numbers, assets, depreciation. Do not die as numbers. Make them. Remember the names. Her grip tightened, then went slack. The rattle in her chest stopped. In the silence of the cave, beneath the crushing weight of the palace, Mother Superior Sophia died. Magdalena stifled a sob, burying her face in her hands. The other sisters began to weep silently, their shoulders shaking. But Elara did not weep. She stared at the dead woman's hands, hands that had once blessed them, then betrayed them to save them, and finally returned to them. She looked at the wall, at the scratches in the stone, lux in tenebris. Then she looked at the candle. The light cast long, dancing shadows against the rough surface of the rock. The shadows looked like threads, intersecting, knotting, weaving. Make them remember. Elara stood up. She extinguished the candle, plunging them back into darkness. We cannot bury her, Elara said, her voice cold and hard as iron. Bashir will count the bodies in the morning. She must go to the furnace. The sisters gasped. Elara! But, Elara continued, cutting through their shock, her soul does not go to the furnace, and her message will not stay in this cave. She turned to the entrance of the fissure. We have been writing our prayers on these walls where no one can see, Elara said. We have been foolish. What do you mean? Magdalena asked, wiping her eyes. Sophia said not to die as numbers, Elara said. She looked back at the workshop where the loom of the ambassadors stood waiting for the morning shift. We don't need paper. We don't need couriers. She held up her hands, the fingers scarred, the nails broken, but the muscles strong. We are weavers, Elara whispered. We speak in knots. We speak in patterns. If they want us to make beauty for their Sultan, we will give him a beauty that screams. She looked at the dark outline of the great loom. We will not send a letter, Elara declared. We will weave the letter, and we will send it to the courts of Europe, right under the Sultan's feet. The order came down from the heavens, carried in the soft, terrifying hands of Bashir the eunuch. The Doge of Venice, Bashir announced, his voice echoing in the damp workshop, has signed a treaty. The Sultan, in his infinite mercy, sends a gift, a tapestry. It must be the largest ever woven in this cellar. It must depict the Garden of Paradise. He unrolled a parchment design. It was a riot of complexity. Peacocks with eyes of real gold thread, rivers of silver silk, and a border of interlaced geometric vines so intricate, it made the eyes ache. You have 4 months, Bashir whispered, leaning over Elara's loom. If it is not perfect, the hands that made it will be removed. He left, leaving the scent of rosewater and fear hanging in the stagnant air. Elara looked at the design. It was beautiful. It was a prison of threads. But as she studied the border, the endless looping vines that symbolized eternity, she saw the opening. Sisters, Elara whispered. The sound of the looms did not stop. They had learned to speak under the rhythm of the shuttle. We will weave the garden, but we will seed the border with our own flowers. She gathered the 3 senior weavers, including Magdalena, during a water break. She showed them a technique from their childhood in the coastal villages, something the old grandmothers used when weaving shrouds for fishermen lost at sea. The weeping knot, Elara explained quietly. We pull the weft thread tight on the upbeat and loose on the downbeat. To the eye, it looks like a variation in the silk's sheen, but to the hand, it feels like a heartbeat. Magdalena finished, her eyes widening. "We will weave the Kyrie," Ilara said. "Long tension, short tension, pause, Kyrie eleison. Lord have mercy," over and over, buried in the vines of the Sultan's victory. The work began. It was a descent into madness. The loom for the Venetian tapestry was a behemoth, requiring 6 women to work abreast. They sat shoulder to shoulder, their fingers flying like hummingbirds. The physical toll was agonizing. The gold thread was stiff and cut their cuticles until they bled. They had to constantly wrap their fingers in fresh rags to keep the pristine silk from staining. But the mental toll was heavier. They were writing a letter in a language of tension. Lord, tighten the knot, snap the thread. Have, loop the silver, let it breathe. Mercy, lock it down. Ilara conducted the symphony of silence. She watched the border grow, inch by agonizing inch. To the untrained eye, it was a masterpiece of Ottoman geometry. But Ilara knew that every third vine carried a scream. It was a tactile Morse code, a rhythm of grief woven into the symbol of imperial power. 3 months passed. The tapestry was finished. It shimmered in the candlelight, a towering wall of emerald and gold, breathtaking in its beauty. Then came the inspection. The heavy iron door groaned open, and Bashir entered, but he stepped aside for another man. Hassan Bey, the imperial master of textiles. Hassan was a man of needles, not swords. He was slight, wearing spectacles perched on a hooked nose, and his fingers were long and sensitive, the hands of a maestro. He did not look at the women, he looked only at the cloth. He walked the length of the tapestry, humming softly. He brought a magnifying glass to the eyes of the peacocks. He checked the dye consistency of the river. The sisters stood with their heads bowed, holding their breath. Hassan reached the border. He ran his hand along the velvet edge. His fingers drifted over the geometric vines. He stopped. He frowned. He rubbed the silk between his thumb and forefinger. He moved his hand 6 inches to the right and rubbed again. The rhythm was there. The weeping knot. To a soldier, it was nothing. To a master weaver, it was an irregularity. A pulse where there should be flatness. The tension here, Hassan murmured, his voice confused. It stutters. He leaned in, his nose inches from the silk. He took a small silver knife from his belt, a tool for cutting loose threads. It is not consistent, Hassan said, his voice hardening. Why does the vine pulse? Is the warp loose? He raised the knife. He was going to cut into the border to inspect the structural integrity of the weave. If he cut it, he would see the double loop knotting. He would see the intentional flaw. The weave is corrupt, Hassan declared, the blade hovering over the message. We must test the strength. Ilara's heart stopped. If he cut it, they were dead. The message would be destroyed and their treason exposed. She looked at Magdalena. Magdalena was standing near the work table, where a heavy iron brazier of hot wax was kept liquid for sealing the ends of the gold rope. Magdalena caught Ilara's eye. There was no fear in her face, only a terrifying resolve. Forgive me, sisters, Magdalena whispered. She didn't stumble. She threw herself. Magdalena lunged forward, her foot hooking the leg of the iron stand. The heavy brazier tipped. A cascade of scalding, molten wax poured down, not onto the tapestry, but directly onto Magdalena's bare foot and shin. A scream tore through the workshop. It was raw, primal, and deafening. My foot! Oh God, my foot! Magdalena shrieked, collapsing onto the stone floor, thrashing in agony as the wax hardened on her burning skin. Hassan flinched violently, dropping the knife. The sudden chaos shattered his concentration. The other sisters rushed to Magdalena, wailing, creating a wall of noise and body movement that blocked Hassan from the tapestry. Clumsy fool, Bashir hissed, rushing forward to kick Magdalena away from the precious silk. Get her out! Do not let the smoke touch the fabric." Hassan looked at the screaming woman, then back at the tapestry. The mood was broken. The exquisite silence required for inspection was gone. He looked at the knife on the floor, then at the chaotic scene. He was a man who detested ugliness, and this was ugly. "Pack it!" Hassan snapped, waving a hand dismissively at the tapestry. "The center is flawless. The border? It is likely just the humidity of this cursed dungeon, affecting the silk. Get it out of this moisture before the whole thing rots." He turned on his heel and marched out, handkerchief pressed to his nose to block the smell of burnt hair and wax. Ilara fell to her knees beside Magdalena. The skin on the young nun's foot was blistering red and white under the cooling wax. Magdalena was sobbing, her teeth clenched so hard her gums bled. But as Ilara gripped her hand, Magdalena squeezed back. 3 times. Father, Son, Holy Spirit. The soldiers rolled the tapestry. The Garden of Paradise, carrying the silent cry of 18 ghosts in its border, was hoisted onto a cart. It began its journey to the sunlight, paid for in blood. The tapestry hung in the great council hall of the Doge's palace in Venice, a shimmering wall of emerald and gold that silenced the room. The courtiers whispered about the Sultan's generosity, admiring the peacocks that seemed to breathe and the silver rivers that caught the torchlight. But Giovanni da Collo did not look at the peacocks. Giovanni was 70 years old, a merchant whose hands were stained with the indigo of 1,000 trade routes. He had been born in a village not 10 miles from the convent of St. Anna. He knew the wind of that coast, he knew the wool, and he knew the knots. He waited until the council had dispersed, then approached the tapestry. His fingers, trembling with age, brushed against the border, the magnificent geometric vines that symbolized the Ottoman conquest. He closed his eyes. He let his fingertips read the silk. Tight, loose, pause, tight, loose, pause. It was not a vine, it was a heartbeat. It was the weeping knot, the specific, sorrowful dialect of the widows from his homeland. Kyrie, eleison. Giovanni's breath hitched. He pressed his ear to the cold silk. It was screaming. It was a choir of ghosts trapped in the Sultan's garden, calling out to a god who spoke Latin. "They are not dead," Giovanni whispered to the empty hall. "They are underground." He did not go to the Doge. Politics took months, and the Doge would not risk a war for a handful of nuns. Giovanni went to his vault. He took everything. 2 weeks later, inside the administrative archives of the Topkapi Palace, the air smelled of dust and corruption. Ibrahim the scribe sat at his desk. He was older now, his face lined with the stress of managing the empire's endless inventory, but his eyes were still cold and calculating. He looked at the small velvet bag on his desk. He opened it. Diamonds, uncut, untraceable, and worth more than his life's wages. He looked up at the Venetian merchant standing in the shadows. "The inventory in the substructure is decaying," Giovanni said softly. "I hear there is a sickness, a sudden, violent plague among the weavers." Ibrahim touched the diamonds. He understood the language of commerce far better than the language of faith. "Plague is a terrible thing," Ibrahim agreed, his voice smooth. "It requires immediate disposal. No autopsy, no burial, just removal to prevent the spread." Ibrahim opened the great imperial ledger, the same black book that had swallowed the sisters at the convent gates 4 years ago. He found the page dated 1474. He dipped his quill in red ink. Beside the entry, 18 female weavers, St. Anna acquisition, he drew a firm horizontal line. He wrote, "Deceased. Cause, black fever. Bodies incinerated and disposed of via southern waste gate." He blew on the ink to dry it. "A tragedy," Ibrahim said, sliding the diamonds into his sleeve. "The carts leave at midnight. Do not be late. The garbage does not wait. The escape was not glorious. It smelled of rotting cabbage and fish guts. The 18 women were smuggled out of the workshop not as heroes, but as refuse. Covered in rough burlap sacks, they were piled into the back of the wooden carts used to haul the palace waste to the docks. Ilara lay still beneath a layer of straw, holding her breath. She could feel the vibration of the wheels on the cobblestones. Every bump was a jolt of terror. If a guard checked the cart, if a sack moved, the lie would unravel, and the executioner's sword would follow. But the guards at the service gate did not check. Who would want to inspect the Sultan's garbage? They waved the carts through, covering their noses. The wheels rumbled from stone to wood. The smell of the sea rushed in, overpowering the rot. They were transferred in the dark, hand over hand, from the cart to the hold of a fast Venetian merchant cog. There were no words spoken, only the soft splash of oars and the creaking of rigging. As the ship pulled away from the Golden Horn, the sun began to bleed over the horizon. Ilara stood on the aft deck. She was wrapped in a warm wool cloak Giovanni had brought, but she shivered, not from cold, but from the sudden, terrifying vastness of the sky. After years of stone ceilings, the open air felt like falling. She looked back. The Topkapi Palace sat on the hill, magnificent and cruel, its domes turning pink in the dawn. Somewhere deep beneath it, in a dark cave, a candle of fat was burnt out. The loom stood empty. She was not the girl who had entered that palace. That girl had died in the dark. The woman standing on the deck had gray in her hair and scars on her fingers that would never heal. She had lost Mother Sophia. She had lost the years of her youth. But she had won. Ilara reached into her tunic. She pulled out a small leather pouch. Inside was a mixture of gray dust, the ashes of the golden prayer book she had burned in the convent hearth, mixed with a pinch of the soot she had gathered from the furnace where they had convinced the guards to burn contaminated rags that were actually Mother Sophia's clothes. It was all that remained of their physical history. Ilara opened the pouch. She reached in and grabbed a handful of the ash. The wind caught it. The gray dust swirled into the air, dancing for a moment against the backdrop of the retreating empire, before scattering into the white wake of the ship. Requiem aeternam, Ilara whispered. But she was smiling. It was a smile that reached her eyes, finally breaking the mask of the ghost she had been forced to become. "We have finished the weave, Mother," she said to the wind. "The ledger is closed. We are not numbers." She looked down at her hands. The scars on her fingertips caught the morning light. They were ugly, twisted, and rough. But as she clenched them into a fist, she felt the strength in them. "God is not in the book," Ilara said, turning her face toward the open sea and the west. "He is in the hands that refuse to stop moving." She took a deep breath of salt air, filling lungs that had breathed dust for too long. "Go," she told the wind. "Tell the world we lived." The story of Sister Ilara and the weavers of Topkapi leaves us with a profound lesson for our own daily lives. We often feel small against the giant mountains we face, whether it is the grief of losing a loved one, the pressure of a job that drains us, or the feeling that our voice does not matter. But Ilara taught us that you do not need an army to defeat the darkness. You do not need a sword. Sometimes the greatest act of rebellion is simply to refuse to give up, to use whatever small power you have, your hands, your art, your kindness, to keep weaving your truth. Even when the world tries to reduce you to a number, remember that your spirit is a fire that no ledger can contain. If the courage of these 18 women touched your heart, please press the like button to honor their memory. Share this story with someone who needs to be reminded of their own inner strength today. And if you want to help us uncover more voices that history tried to silence, Please subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Let us end with a prayer. May the God who sees all things in secret grant you the strength of Ilara and the wisdom of Sophia. May he be the lamp unto your feet when you walk through the valleys of shadow. And may he remind you that even in your darkest moments, you are never forgotten. If you believe that light will always overcome darkness, write Amen in the comments below.